Good afternoon. I almost said good morning. Welcome to Goucher Environmental Dialogues. I'm Dr. Jen DeRosa. I'm the director of our master's degree in environmental sustainability and management here at Goucher. And if this is your first time joining one of our environmental dialogues, Goucher Environmental Dialogues are a web-based speaker series. We feature cultivated conversations with environmental, sustainability, and climate leaders, visionaries, and innovators. And this series is hosted by our master's degree program, as I mentioned, Environmental Sustainability and Management. If you have any questions, either about the master's degree, if you're interested in that, or about future events, I am happy to share more about that. You can always reach out to me via email. I'm also going to post quickly in the chat a link to our link tree. Well, I'll do it again after I'm done talking because I can't find the link, but I'll share a link so you can see upcoming events, and you can also connect with us on social media. Just a note about upcoming events, we're hosting a film screening of the documentary The Oil Machine on March 7th, so next week at 4:30 p.m. in the Forum at Goucher. And it's free. You're welcome to attend, and we'll be speaking with some of the filmmakers. And then I'm hosting an information session about our master's degree on March 12th at 6 p.m. And that's a webinar, so you're welcome to join from wherever you are at. But our conversation today, while we're all coming together today, is to talk about conservation, wildlife, and expeditions with our guest, a conservation and security expert, Dr. Sandra Elvin. Now, Sandra is as I mentioned, she's a conservation and security risk professional. She was previously the director of expeditions for National Geographic Society's Climate Change Impact Initiative. And in the field, she has directed a scientific expedition to Mount Everest. And I think she mentioned to me once it was one of the longest times that a woman has stayed up at base camp. So we can ask her more about that in a second. And a C2 source expedition on the Ganges River in Bangladesh to India. She maintained the logistics and safety aspects while ensuring scientific and policy objectives were met. Not an easy task, I'm sure. Sandra completed her doctoral degree in environmental studies at York University in Canada, where she examined the adverse effects of industrial development on black bears. She earned her master's degree at Dalhousie University in Canada, where she addressed collisions between North Atlantic right whales and commercial vessels from a scientific and a policy perspective. And she completed another graduate degree in conservation criminology, where she examined the illegal wildlife trade. In her previous roles, she was a professional guide on a polar bear and beluga whale trips in Canada, giant panda and Asiatic black bear trips in China, and snow leopard expeditions in Mongolia. So I'll say this and I'll say it again. Sandra is probably the most fascinating woman in the world. So please join me. I know your mics are turned off and your cameras are turned off because it's a webinar, but you can still use the chat. So I'm going to encourage you to do that. Please join me in the chat by giving a warm welcome to Sandra, and feel free to also indicate where you are joining us from, which state or city. And if you have any questions during my conversation today with Sandra, feel free to ask them in the chat, and I'll try to give voice to them towards the middle of our conversation. So welcome, Sandra. I'm so glad to have you today. Can you maybe start by giving us some background as to what led you to a career in conservation and guiding these types of trips?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me. Such a pleasure to talk about my experiences in my life. It's just great. I'm so glad Goucher has this series. So thank you so very much, and thank you, Jen, for inviting me to have this conversation with you. So what got me started? I won't go back too far, but after my bachelor's degree, I actually took a position up with Project Seahorse, and this is in the Philippines. So I was an underwater diver for seahorse, and actually we were looking at marine protected areas and the effectiveness of them on seahorse abundance and diversity. And from that, that field experience just really launched my career into, field-based studies and field-based work. And while I was doing my PhD, I had an opportunity to guide trips, to guide wildlife trips. And my first trips were beluga whale trips, and then polar bears, and I did that for about 6 years. And then after that is when I did the snow leopard trip in Mongolia, and that was just incredible. But how I actually got started into guiding is actually a really funny story. I owe a lot of gratitude and thanks to two people. So these were the top two head guides for the company that I was working for. And what happened was because it was an American company and polar bear trips happen in a small, very important place called Churchill, which is very northern Manitoba. Um, and so a lot of guides come from all over the world, and they come through Winnipeg to get their work visas, and then off they go, back and forth between Winnipeg and Churchill. And it was actually a customs officer in Winnipeg who thought, wait a minute, there's all these guides who are coming from all over the world to really work in my land, in my country. And he was like, where are the Canadians? So he had the company, the guiding company, do a labor market research and really put a vast effort into finding Canadian guides. And at that time, I had some previous bear experience because I worked for the Ministry of Ontario and on a nuisance bear project. So I had some bear experience, and my PhD advisor knew about this. And so when the company was doing their labor market research, and they thought, who might have the flexibility to work, the seasonal job, which is just October, November for polar bear guides, and who might be, I guess, crazy enough to accept a position like that. And they thought academics, like it must be academics who can do this.
That makes sense.
So, yep. So my PhD advisor came to me and she said, hey, I think you should look into this opportunity. And so I applied. And because at that time I didn't have any guiding experience, I had all this field experience, but no guiding. So the top two guides invited me down into Denver, where the company is headquarters. And I'll never forget, they picked me up from my hotel and they said, okay, here's your day of interviews. You're gonna spend the day with us. And as somebody does when they get ready for their interview, you have a collared shirt and a suit jacket, and you're prepared for sort of solid business interview. And they took one look at me and said, do you want to change your shoes? Because we're actually gonna go for a hike. I was like, oh, okay. But I didn't bring any hiking gear. I brought business interview gear. So at least I had shoes from the plane. So we went back to my hotel room, changed my shoes. We went for a hike, and the climate, I mean, going from Toronto sea base level to Denver, not sea base level, high altitude or higher altitude than Toronto. We went for a hike in the mountains, which again I didn't expect, but I was huffing and puffing, and I was like, oh my God, I can't keep up over here. Like, this is the air is so thin. But luckily the top two guides were actually a couple, and they were married. So they're having a great conversation between two of them. And I'm like way back, way back on the trail. They're not even paying attention to me and how terrible this is going for me. And then we come off the trail, we go for lunch, and then we go to the office. And, according to them, it was one of the best interviews they ever had, because it was fun. We're out in nature, we're hiking. But yeah, I didn't say very much during that during that part of the interview. Everything else happened after. But I'm still grateful to them for taking a chance on me, and just opening the doors up to the guiding world. It's been great. Oh.
That sounds like a wonderful experience and opportunity. First of all, having an interview in which you're hiking instead of, sitting in the hot seat sounds awesome. But at the same point, I know a lot of our students in the graduate program, and a lot of people that are just passionate in general about the environment. You hear and you see about these big expeditions and these guided trips that sometimes people can pay to go on and different things like that. And you wonder, wow, how do I get started doing something like that? So it's nice to see that there is an organized industry for this, because I think that helps increase awareness about wildlife and different landscapes. Now I know in the bio that I just went over, you worked with a lot of different animals throughout your career. So I guess could you maybe first give us an overview of the different kinds of animals you've either researched or led trips to observe and studied, and what did that involve?
Sure. So throughout my career, I couldn't really decide between focusing on the marine landscape or terrestrial landscape. And so I thought, hey, I'll do both. So, so as I mentioned before, that one of the first kind of field-based projects that I did was in the Philippines, and that was, really looking at seahorses. They're highly endangered and they're traded in the illegal wildlife trade. And when I got my scuba license, fish are great and they're colorful and they're wonderful. But when you get to these smaller invertebrates who just have this whole other world unto themselves, and part of my work was actually taking seahorses off of the corals that they're hanging onto and and measuring them. And the best thing to do is to take off the seahorse very carefully and put it on your own baby finger. And then you can take out your measure, your ruler and measure them. And having the feeling of a seahorse tail like wrapped around your finger and just like squeezing it and just hanging out there is just incredible. It's one of the best feelings in the world. That, and also looking into the eyes of a wild polar bear, like straight into the eyes of a wild polar bear, like those two, there's nothing in this world that compares to those feelings. Just incredible. And from one to the other, prey to predator, I mean that those feelings are just magical. But yeah, so after I came back from the Philippines, then I went up to rural Ontario and I worked on a year-long project there. I started off by doing a lot of lake assessments. And so in Ontario and a lot of parts of Canada, there's a big focus on recreational use of lands, and especially of like fishing and hunting, those kinds of opportunities. And a lot of the lakes are becoming anoxic, due to various, pollution considerations. And so the goal of what I was starting to do was to really assess which kind of lakes were actually suitable for restocking purposes. So the government was looking at, which lakes are, kind of viable for different species, different native species, of course. And so because I had all this marine experience, assessing diversity and abundance of species and habitats, it translated over to the freshwater world as well, doing very similar work. And so that was a summer project that I did. And the ministry was quite happy with my work. And so I stayed on the rest of the year. And that was the year that the Ontario government had canceled the spring bear hunt. And black bears in Ontario, it's a controversial topic. And whether you're pro black bear or not pro black bear, whether you're pro hunting or not pro hunting, these are the kinds of debates and issues that happen in rural communities. And so when they canceled the spring bear hunt, the influx of bears through communities, destroying property, coming through and destroying garbage, that's been left out the night before for collection in the morning. These kinds of issues were blamed on the government, like the government canceling the hunt. And so trapping black bears, what was called so-called nuisance bears, and relocating them somewhere else became part of my job as I was working with a person who was designing this program called Bearwise, which is really to cohabitate with bears. And how do we live in a community that is bear safe? And so that was great. That was great work. But I always want to do my master's, and I always want to continue. As a woman in the STEM field, getting a PhD is your ticket around the world, but it's also your ticket at the table. And so I always knew that. I knew I had to keep going. So I left that bear position and I went back to the marine world. And that's when I did my master's on North Atlantic right whales. And then I was fortunate. After my master's, I joined a company and I was a project scientist doing environmental assessments. And it's great to work for a company where you get to do the field work and then do the reports and see changes in policy or however industrial companies have to mitigate their harm to the environment. So that was great. But again, got to keep going. And that's when I changed focus and I did my PhD. And my PhD looked at black bears in Labrador. And Labrador is one of the northernmost eastern province in Canada. Very, very rough landscape, very, very, very unforgiving landscape and kind of world in general. But it was a massive hydro development project that was going to be established. And so black bears are kind of, very low on the ranking of species that are considered to be important. Other endangered species like caribou and eagles, those had much more importance in terms of environmental assessments than they did black bears. So my PhD looked at, what are some of the mitigation options for habitat destruction for bears? When does reintroduction make sense? When does rehabilitation make sense? When does translocation make sense? So I was looking at different aspects, all related to black bears. So that was great. And at the same time, I was guiding.
Is that because the black bears are they considered more of a nuisance species up in Canada and not a charismatic species, as we sometimes say in the environmental world?
Yeah, they're seen as more kind of like pigeons here. They're
Huh,
everywhere. They're abundant. They get in the way. Pigeons. Their their fecal matter gets in the way, and it's toxic. And yeah, so it's
yeah,
kind of perceived that way. But it's a really
interesting.
important indicator species of environmental health, of ecosystem
Hmm.
health. So yeah, I'm pro black bear.
Yeah, it's funny because like I know I take my family to Shenandoah National Park in the fall or in the summer, and like looking for black bears are really, really high ranking thing to do. So I feel like it's interesting how the perceptions based on where you're at change for different wildlife species. That's really fascinating. Um, Now I know also I mentioned that you were a director of for National Geographic, you were director of expeditions, which sounds like a very, very challenging thing to be in charge of. Can you tell me what kind of expeditions you were leading and what did that involve?
Definitely. So it's kind of rare for National Geographic to have an in-house built, team of expedition, leaders. And so designing the most, well, the record is the most comprehensive scientific expedition to Everest, was sort of a key goal as part of understanding climate change in extreme environments.
Hmm.
So it was funded by Rolex. So it's a partnership between National Geographic and Rolex, and the overall program is called the Perpetual Planet. And so that expedition was going to be one of three. And so there's going to be Everest, and then there's going to be understanding climate change, extreme environments of the rainforest, and then the oceans. And so the mountains, tallest mountain was the first one. Unfortunately, the other two didn't work out because the pandemic hit, and so we
Mm.
really couldn't pull off what we had done before. And so at the very beginning, there were only two of us really kind of spearheading this, full time, full tilt this expedition. We had about 6 months to design it and to pull it off. And so I was in charge of the logistics, the equipment, the safety, the personnel, that whole part, working very closely with a wonderful fixer, back in Nepal. And then
Mhm.
my counterpart was kind of engaging the scientists and putting together their science plans. And so together we worked to really, set the stage for success and making sure that what we were doing could be done safely and have everyone come home. So it was a massive team, over 30 scientists, and about 80 people in total between the porters and our elite Sherpa climbing team, between the fixers and the cooks and anything you can imagine to have life on a glacier far away from human development. You can just imagine all the needs that have to be pulled off for that. So that was in the spring of 2019. And when I came back, at the same time, there was another program that was looking at plastics pollution up and along the Ganges River. And their science plans were pre-monsoon and post-monsoon. And there were a couple issues, with the pre-monsoon expedition at that time, which was concurrent, same time as the Everest one. So when I came back, National Geographic asked me to then head out and do the post-monsoon expedition to help out with
Hmm.
that team as well. And so that's when I handed out to Bangladesh and India to do the expedition along the Ganges River in October, November of 2019.
Oh,
Also
wow.
scientific, also
Yeah.
incredibly logistically complicated, but a different focus,
Mhm.
different funding pot completely, but fascinating as well. And I'm very fortunate to have been on both.
Well, that's really neat. So I guess the Everest, I'll ask about Everest first, and then I'll ask about the Ganges one. Um, you assembled this team of scientists. So what were the different things that they were looking at on Everest versus what were they looking at in the Ganges trip and evaluation? I guess what was the scientific goals of those?
Okay, so yeah, so on the Everest side, there were five main kind of scientific fields that we were looking at.
Hmm.
There was glaciology, geology, biology, geography, and then mapping. And
Okay.
these were kind of the main disciplines, I guess, for lack of a better term. It's the main scientific disciplines
Hmm.
that all the teams were assembled underneath. And so when I was at base camp, I had to keep in mind where all the different teams were because they were spatially located in different places along the mountain. Also temporally different as well. Some teams started later, some teams came up and went back down, some teams came up and they kept going up, while other teams were a lake somewhere else completely
Hmm.
completely different. So so I was like the central hub,
Mhm.
and I was the intake person for the check-ins. I was making sure everyone was healthy and evacuating people when they needed to be evacuated, bringing them back when they were okay again. So I was the central person to the spider web of what was happening up and
Oh.
down the mountain. Versus the other one, the plastics pollution one, there were only three kind of main teams. There was the
Mhm.
land-based team, the water team, and the social team. And again, I was the hub, but I was also we were all together. Like it was mostly an all-female team of scientists and of leaders. We had a few males of course with us as well, but that focus was really all female. And just with three teams, much smaller team, maximum was about 20 people.
Mhm.
It was much easier to kind of keep tabs on where people were and check in with them. And I could go out with them as well and spend full days with each team and then come back and regroup at the end of each day. So on that expedition, everyone came back to the same place. We saw each other. We traveled together the whole time.
Mhm.
Whereas Everest, people were just sparsed out.
Mm.
And then some would come back at the end of the day, but some had tents and other lodging elsewhere, like throughout the mountain.
Oh, that's neat. So for each one, just sort of two questions. Like a Is there a final report or probably a series of reports associated with their scientific findings? And then the other question is, you yourself managing all these logistics, I imagined you had some sort of like debrief or some sort of analysis or write up at the end of this is how this went, this is what we should do different next time we go back or something like that. I don't know if
Definitely
that's a
for
question, more
the
of a statement.
yeah
Sorry.
yeah for the Everest team, we're still publishing results.
Wow.
Lots of peer-reviewed journal publications have come out of that.
Mhm.
I, like being an academic and a scientist as well, wanting to publish was also, something because like what we pulled off was just incredible. So I actually wrote a piece on the expedition logistics and,
Awesome.
how that all worked and what it took to pull it off. So One Earth is the journal
Mm.
who actually published a special edition just on the Everest expedition, and
Cool.
and my article is in there, which is
Awesome.
great. Yeah, yeah. Well, plastics pollution is a little bit slower to pull off. Still analyzing a lot of the different pieces. What's interesting is that one of the plastics pollution scientists that was with us, we actually gave her some of the water samples from Everest, and she
Mm.
also examined uh, plastic, elements or
Mhm.
microplastics in the water samples from Everest, and so we were able to publish a piece on that as well.
Oh,
But it's funny
wow.
because she had never even been
Yeah.
to Everest, but here we were. We're like, hey,
Yeah,
you analyze
here's
the
some
water in
water.
Ganges. Can you do it? Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
that's really cool. Well, I know that so some people listening probably know that our master's degree is working with other graduate programs at Goucher to bring students to Nepal, graduate students to Nepal next January as part of an elective course, a study abroad. Although, caveat here, we are not going to Everest Base Camp or Everest. Too much risk and liability, I think, for any college. But one thing that I find fascinating is for the Everest region, the impact of both climate change and also the impact of so many people trying to go to Everest now. It's so busy. So I guess my question for you is, as you were there, I understand you went to Everest more than once, a reconnaissance and the actual trip, and then what were some of the impacts that are being discussed in that region where you were at with respect to climate change, or even with respect to like the heavy foot traffic of trekkers going up to base camp or even going up to the summit?
Yeah. So I think I might have spoke when I said the main five. So meteorology was one of the main components, and so
Yeah.
installing the world's highest weather station,
Hmm.
up on that was as a record, but also the results from the weather patterns and what we're seeing
Mm.
are really showing the extremes of what's happening, and the high winds, and it's the impacts of all of that together that are being felt downstream and through the watersheds, and affecting potentially hundreds of thousands of people, down below the main glacier. But there's also a phenomenon called glacial lake outbursts,
Mm.
and the possibility of glacial lakes melting, underneath and actually bursting, is something that is well understood. in terms of its ability to really affect, human development and human lives. Scientifically, there's still so much to unpack there and to really understand. But we do know that climate change does have an impact, and it's not something to be kind of discounted or thought of, oh, that's a later problem. It's definitely, a problem now. As the glacier is melting in discontinuous patterns, even just, anecdotally, you can see like a tuna can from the 1970s that, is surfacing, that would
Wow.
have come down from, Camp 1 or Camp 2, and you're seeing it, down at base camp, and it's got rust on it, and you just know that it's got to be affecting the waters in some terrible ways that are affecting livestock downstream, humans downstream, just the ability to cook vegetables in clean water, is something that is definitely affecting. So you see that a lot, and then it's hard not to think about, kind of your own impact when you're there. We had fleece jackets, and we know that fleece is plastic and fleece sheds, and so we know that we ourselves were contributing to potentially, some really, really terrible, harmful impacts. So that in itself was hard, thinking about our own expeditions impact and thinking about in general, kind of human effect on the natural landscape. It's hard. Yeah.
Yeah, I can only imagine, because I mean, it's such an honor to be able to be in such a beautiful place like that, a special place. But at the same time, the the presence of someone being there is impacting that place. So it's something that I think that a lot of us who are interested in like seeing some of these sites, um,
Mhm.
are very much aware of. I have to ask you, what was it like to live at Everest Base Camp? What was the longest time frame that you were there? And then maybe what was your favorite part about it, and what was the biggest challenge associated with
Oh.
living there?
um, so I was there for 43 days. It is possible that is the longest time a Western woman has stayed there. It's very hard to confirm this number. It'd be very difficult, but it's possible. And 43 days is a very long time, and
Yeah.
that's not including the 12 days to check in, up to base camp. So in general, it's just a long time, at high altitude for somebody whose body is not physically used to high altitudes all the time. Very different from the local communities like the Sherpas, whose body, whose blood, oxygen content is a little bit different from ours. They're
Mhm.
used to the high altitude, so a little bit easier for for the local communities to thrive in high altitude environments. So my least favorite part was probably the time it would take to walk, let's say 100 meters. Like you're
Mhm.
huffing and puffing, and you haven't exercised, you haven't done anything, and you're trying to accomplish even the smallest things, and the air is so thin. You're like,
Mm.
wow, brushing my teeth is so easy at sea level, and up here it's like, oh, it's a workout.
Wow. Well, I wouldn't
Yeah,
say you had no exercise. You did hike all the way in, right? So there's that
that's right.
exercise.
Right. But very slow. You have to take it very, very, very slow.
Yeah.
So it doesn't feel like a workout because you're not sweating, but you're huffing, you're definitely huffing and puffing.
Huh.
That, and also the avalanches that we would hear at night. They were incredibly scary, and you never know. You never know if you're gonna
Mhm.
wake up under snow or if it's gonna hit you. They were very loud and just magical, and they just remind you that the power of nature is all around you, and you're just one small little thing,
Mm.
living on a glacier.
Wow.
um, and my favorite thing, I think, was being surrounded by such amazing people, especially the Sherpa community. They are such an amazing, just 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 culturally rich, people, and
Mm.
they welcome us into their country and on their lands, and the conversations with them are so enlightening and so interesting. It's a different way of life, and it's just amazing what they do every day.
Mhm.
And yeah,
Yeah,
that's my favorite part.
I am amazed by the Sherpa peoples, just climbing Mount Everest is so normal for them. We had a trekking guide, my colleagues and I, when we were in Nepal, and he was like, "Yeah, I've climbed Everest. My son's climbed it, and my second son is climbing it right now." And it's just like, wow, like that, just the whole living up at that high altitude and the climbing is part of a way of life. Whereas for maybe someone who grew up in the Western world, it's like, okay, it's like a bucket list type accomplishment for some people. So,
Mhm.
well, that's exciting to hear. I have also a question for you about extreme environments. And I know we've already probably covered the Everest extreme environment, but you've been to some extreme places in your work. What would you say is the coolest thing that you've been involved in and the most challenging, maybe beyond Everest?
So the trip to Mongolia to go see snow leopards was really special. So Mongolia is a really interesting country,
Hmm.
very rich in terms of culture, of course, but also just in terms of capability. So, the reason why I say that is because so the snow leopard trip would start in Ubi in Ulaanbaatar, which is the capital region, but to actually
Hmm.
go see a snow leopard, you have to head out west to the Altai Mountains, and that's where we were. And I led two trips back to back to try to find a snow leopard, the most elusive cat in the world.
Hmm.
There's a statistic, I'm not sure, I should look it up to verify it, but they say that more people have been to the moon than have seen a snow leopard in the wild. So yeah, so I need to confirm that. I need to do some
Wow.
academic, skills on that to really dissect it. But I was very lucky where after 28 days of searching, we actually saw a snow leopard. And this was, we're up on the side of a mountain and we're looking through a scope, like across a valley and like up a hill. And there she was. And I'll actually show you a photo of
Oh yeah.
this wonderful snow leopard. Let me bring it up. Um, Here we go. Can you see it? Can you see the photo?
I see the photo
Okay.
and I think I see the snow leopard. I think.
So here she
Ah,
is right here.
okay.
You can see my cursor.
Yeah.
So she actually had a small cub right here behind this
Oh,
rock over here.
yeah.
And she was walking back and forth. She had a kill. It was a goat over here.
Yeah.
It's a little hard to see. So we were able to watch her go walk back and forth and back and forth. And you can see her beautiful long tail right here. So this photo
Yeah.
is actually taken through the scope.
Okay. I was gonna
So
ask, like,
yeah.
did you have to magnify that a lot to get that, or is that like, no, I whipped out my iPhone and took a picture?
Oh, I wish. No, this is actually a
Okay.
phone into the scope, and I took a photo in the scope.
Okay.
So
That's really
yeah,
cool.
just
Yeah.
incredible. We're so lucky to have seen her, and we waited for hours and hours and hours to catch a glimpse of something out there. And then so to have her, the cub's head would just kind of pop up sometimes out the side
Hmm.
of the rock, and that's how we knew that what she was doing is she was going back and forth between the kill and the cub.
Hmm.
Really, really incredible. But you can kind of get a sense of the landscape of what it was like. I mean,
Mm.
it looks like the moon. Like there's no trees around, at least where we were. And so a couple like, there's so many things that happened while we're out there. Like our cars broke down, and you look around and there's just kind of nothing around you. Like it just feel what I think it would feel
Hmm.
like being on the moon. And you can as far as the eye can see, but then all of a sudden you look in the distance, you're like, is that something moving? And then there are four men coming to us to help us on
Hmm.
horseback. And they're wearing, their traditional, clothing, and they open up their clothing. There's all these tools to come
Awesome.
and help to. So not only did they know that we were in trouble, but they
Yeah.
had the right tools to fix the car, and they had the knowledge, and it was just amazing. And that's
Hmm.
kind of that sums up Mongolia kind of right there. Another time, I had a client who was not feeling very well, and
Hmm.
I could tell that she just needed to be seen, by a medical professional, or she needed something. So the next place that we went to, we're setting up, and it started to hail, and so we're kind of scrambling to set up the tents, and I'm thinking about this woman, and well, it turned out that kind of the neighboring yurt that was maybe about a 20-minute walk away, but we could see, but it turned out that the woman there was the regional doctor, and
Hmm.
she had been trained in Thailand, so she had gone to medical school in Thailand, and so she was full-blown licensed doctor, and she was able to help out my client,
Hmm.
and she lived her nomadic life. Like she still just came back from med school, and she lived her nomadic. She continued on nomadic life, and that's
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 neat.
Mongolia. So yeah.
That's awesome. I've never been to Mongolia, but yeah, and I know it's also there's a wealth of paleontology discoveries that come out of
Mm.
Mongolia back when I was a dinosaur nerd in my childhood. So it's one of those places that I would love to see. Now, I was curious about the snow leopard because I know I forget what type of leopard that we would encounter when I was in Cameroon, but that you never saw them. They were always up in the trees. So
Mm.
do the snow leopards in Mongolia, is that their main habitat is hiding in and around the rocky outcrops?
Yeah, yeah, very much, very much.
Hmm.
They're really excellent at um, climbing, or at least staying on these, 45 to 35-degree slopes, like slopes that we could never just, even attempt to climb. But there
Hmm.
they are, bounding along, and they're following their prey. They're eating the mountain goats and the ibexes, and who are also incredible at just hanging out on the side of a of a cliff.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so so they're they're just going where their prey is. Um, yeah, and
Neat.
they're just amazing at what they do. They're amazing at
Oh,
being leopards. Yeah.
yeah, that's cool. What an exciting thing to be able to witness. Um, I also wanted to ask you about your new company. I understand you recently become the founder and president of your new company, Safe Trek Services. Can you tell me more about the goal of your company and what is it that you're doing?
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much. I'm so excited about my new company. So this company, yeah, as you mentioned, is called Safe Track Services, and so I'm really trying to empower the next generation of people like me, of expedition leaders, or people going out and doing conservation studies, or even just kind of the scientific community writ large, or really anyone who's going to a high risk location, whether it's for wildlife or
Hmm.
human cause, or social unrest, or political unrest. And so I'm really trying to help people do what I did, but safely, and take
Hmm.
risks that are sensible, and that makes sense, and to make sure that people do come home safe and sound with all fingers and toes and eyes and ears. And so I offer a variety of training options. So I'm a self-defense instructor. I'm also a mental health first aid instructor. I'm also a CPR and first aid and AED instructor for adults and pediatrics,
Hmm.
and a first aid for severe trauma instructor. And then I also, with some partners, because it takes a lot to put these other courses on, but I also teach hostile environment awareness training. So,
Mm.
for example, if somebody is going to, for example, like a war-torn area, or difficult, challenging place like Afghanistan, South Sudan, Israel right now, they would their organization should push them to take this kind of training in order
Hmm.
to enable them you know yeah, to survive, basically. So
Hmm.
we provide training in a safe environment, and it's all about muscle memory, and practicing these skills and these tools, so that when you are under high stress and under duress, you can perform, and you
Hmm.
can take the right actions to make sure that you do come home safe. So that's the training is one part, but I also do kind of consulting and large project management, because you can imagine pulling off these expeditions. There's a million pieces, and they can all fall apart very quickly. But to map them all together and put the connecting dots is something that I kind of specialize in.
Hmm.
And then also threat assessments, and just kind of sitting down and doing like a desktop risk mitigation,
Hmm.
and teaching how to do a risk assessment, and then putting together the mitigation plan is something that I also offer. So
Hmm.
I think it's 2024, and I think that organizations have a really big duty of care to their personnel when they send them out, and it's no longer okay for people to just do things without training and without
Hmm.
risk assessments. So if you're working for an organization who's making you do that, I can help that. I can help,
Hmm.
you know, reduce, bridge that gap there. So,
That's that there's such a need for that, especially in the environmental field when where groups are going into, remote, very remote places. I remember the old days. I won't name the institution, but I was an undergraduate at a great institution, but we would do field trips, like multi-day field trips. And I don't think there was any planning going on in terms of like safety and security. It was just like, well, we're just going to go into the field. So I'm sure that has since changed because that was back in like the 1990s, a long time ago. But I completely hear you about the need for those types of training and services and even the consulting. I have done the wilderness first responder training.
oh, great.
And I feel like if you're gonna go into the wilderness, this is so empowering because if anything happens, whether it's a snake bite or you have blisters that get, infected because you're bathing in the swamp or something, like, you know what to do. You're not going to be uncomfortable. You're not going to get sick. Well, you might get sick, but you know what to do if you get sick. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I think it's very, very important. That's great. Um, and when I send out, I should have told everyone I'm going to send out the recording of this later on. I'm happy to also share your company if anyone wants to
Oh, great.
dig deeper
Great.
into that.
Thank
Um,
you. Thank you.
yeah. And I also was going to mention too, I don't know if our audience knows, you are an instructor also for Goucher College for our Master's in Environmental Sustainability and Management. Sandra teaches our environmental policy core course. And so just a heads up if you're interested in having a class with her, she's teaching for us this summer. Um, Before I ask my last question, I wanted to remind our audience that even though your mics are turned off and your camera's turned off, you can ask questions in the chat, and I will give voice to your questions after I ask the last question. So I say that now so you have time to think about what it is you want to ask, and you can type it in the chat. Um, so since we have several graduate students from Goucher College listening, and I'm sure they're fascinated by your career path and all of the fun things that you've done and been involved with. Do you have any recommendations for someone who's interested in this type of work and how someone can get involved in this type of work?
So definitely. So I think to put yourself kind of at the leading forefront of, maybe an opportunity that you might apply for, especially internships. There's so many internships out there, and I feel strongly about this. That I don't really support organizations who don't pay their interns.
Mm,
Or even if it's just a small stipend, even if it covers just your cell phone bill, just something to show value for your work. And there are lots of companies out there that do pay interns.
mm,
In fact, I believe the National Geographic summer internship opportunities are open right now, if anyone's
mm,
interested in applying, and those are paid, incredibly competitive, as you can imagine, to get on those. And then there's other projects like the Project Seahorse one that I did. At that time, everything was covered, but now I do think that you need to pay for your own flight. But once you get there, then your room and board and everything else is covered. So even
mm,
if there's just something to show the value, of you and what you're doing, is something that I recommend. And taking a sensible risk, in those opportunities, whether it's a month out, and for example, in Minnesota, I know they have a lot of black bear kind of research, and there's like a viewing area you can go and volunteer at. And again, they
mhm,
cover your room and board. You just kind of have to get there. So I don't necessarily mean like a payment, like cash payment to yourself, but in some way something is covered, for your stay and for your time. Um, so taking as many courses as you can to put yourself at the top of that selection pool. So for
mhm,
example, as Jen mentioned, the Wilderness First Responder course, definitely take that course. That's an expensive one. There are other options. There's Wilderness First Aid.
mhm,
That's like a weekend course, a couple $100s. These will put you over the edge. When you have two candidates and you're looking at someone for field-based work, you'll take the one who comes, with the training as well, already.
mhm,
um, there's also, it's kind of just other opportunities, and there's that common mantra where it says, if you love what you do, you'll never have to work a day in your life.
mhm,
So if you kind of keep that with you, and just walk through those doors, they may be risky, they may be scary or intimidating, but if you have all the right courses and training and tools at your disposal that you've done already, then you can take that first step through that door, and just have fun and just enjoy
mhm.
it. Mhm.
Those are very good recommendations. Yeah, I agree with you. Like, there are a lot of good internships out there in the environmental world, but make sure you get some sort of reciprocity for your
Yeah.
time and effort. Yeah, definitely. And that is a very good way to get your foot in the door with different organizations and get more experience as well. We have a question from Ben in the chat, and then just a reminder, anyone else, if you have questions, please type them in the chat. Ben is asking, in your experience, what are some common gaps in understanding between conservation professionals and communities?
Oh, that's great. So that's really kind of country dependent. If I could generalize though, it's so a long time ago, like in the 70s and the 60s, when conservationists would go out into different landscapes and different countries, different communities, they would bring sort of a Western point of view
Hmm.
to that community who might have a very, very different approach and a very different understanding of their landscape. And that has changed, which is great, because now it's a much more collaborative environment, and it's much more sort of a mutual understanding and mutual sharing of knowledge.
Hmm.
And it was taking a long time to get there. Conservation is slow, and
Hmm.
it's because things grow slowly. Plants grow slowly. It takes at least a couple generations of understanding animals and how they work, and in relation to their landscape, to really understand if decisions are being made correctly for whatever goal it is, whether it's to enhance a habitat or bring back an animal species. And
Hmm.
so bridging that gap between Western science and local knowledge is going well, but I think there's still a lot more to do to bridge that gap, because of some of the damage that has been done back in the 70s and the 60s, when it
Hmm.
was like, this is the way we do it, and this is the way it should be done,
Hmm.
and that wasn't always necessarily the right approach. So yeah, understanding, checking your assumptions at the door, and coming to the table with an open mind, I think would benefit just about everybody. So
That makes sense because I think we hear a lot more conversation now in the environmental world, especially in the management space and the policy space, about making sure all the stakeholders are at the table, and the local knowledge and the local communities in which a lot of these projects are meant to be implemented, being part of those decision makers instead of being told we're going to do this,
definitely.
because they know that landscape better than anybody. It's their home. Yeah, so that's good to hear. We have another question from Cameron. What are some of the biggest differences between the environmental fields in the US and Canada? Oh, good question. And
Oh,
thank you for joining us. He's also a fellow Dalhousie grad, so awesome.
oh, wow, that's great. Oh, how exciting. So one of the big differences, I think, is in how we approach, well, I mean, provincial versus states. I mean, the power alone, power
Mhm.
dynamics, I'll kind of put that aside. I think it's a whole other hour we need to kind of dissect that part.
A future
Um,
talk.
but yeah, but the way in which we approach ownership of lands and of water and resources, I think, is probably the main difference that I found being here in the US. I've been in the US now for about 10 years. And so let's take an example. So all water in Canada, including raindrops, puddles, ponds, all of that in Canada is owned by the federal government. I mean, owned
Hmm.
is the management responsibility of the Department of Fisheries and Oceans.
Hmm.
Very different from here. Um, and even like when it comes to the park structure, like the
Mhm.
parks in Canada are very much nationally um, recognized and nationally managed. There are provincial parks, of course, as well, and same here, state and national parks. But just the ability to use land in the way that somebody would want is just very, very different. It's
Hmm.
it's it's different. We call it crown lands up in Canada, and I don't
Hmm.
think there's a similar concept to here. Like there's no, maybe the monuments, I guess, here for presidential
Oh, our national
lands, I guess that
monuments.
would be
Yeah.
the, yeah. But those
Yeah.
are very small and kind of central, like they're kind of designed around one aspect.
Hmm.
Whereas up in Canada, there's, it's if it's not a provincially kind of designated area, it's
Hmm.
automatically belongs to the federal government. And there's a lot of controversies around that, because the First Nations communities are saying, well, if it's federal, it means it's ours. And federal government saying, well, no, you waived that, when you signed the treaties, back in the 50s. And
Hmm.
um, so there's just still a lot of controversy there, still a lot of
Hmm.
reconciliation work to do there, especially with the First Nations communities.
Yeah.
They're still owed a lot.
Hmm.
But I think that's, yeah, very, very different here. Yeah.
It does seem that Canada's, I would say, further ahead than the US when it comes to um, restitution and for their Indigenous First Nations. And but I'm not sure. That's just my personal view. I'm not sure how accurate that is. But I had a question too, and this isn't in the chat, but in our public land system in the US, we have a dark history of removing Indigenous peoples and being like, okay, this is pristine. In Canada, is there a public land system? Do they allow the First Nations to still live in what was formerly their land?
They do.
Okay.
It depends which First Nation community. So some
Okay.
First Nations have treaties that are recognized by the federal government, and some don't, not yet.
Hmm.
Or yeah, and so a lot of work to do with that
Okay.
as well, with the Indigenous communities, I should say. So there are different provisions. Like for example, um, the reservation system. So some reservations are dry, and some reservations allow alcohol use and other things. And so the management of reservations is very much left to the Indigenous communities themselves.
Hmm.
And there are certain benefits, but they only go so far. So for example, in every university class, no matter where in Canada, there are two spots that have to be open for any Indigenous person to take for free.
Hmm.
It's kind of Canada's way of allowing educational opportunities for Indigenous communities.
Hmm.
However, they have to live on reservations. And so when
Hmm.
I was at McGill, I had a friend. So I played rugby, at McGill, and I had one of my teammates who lived on a reservation, and was able to take advantage of this. And she was going to go to, her dream was to go to law school,
Hmm.
but she had to commute 3 hours.
Oh my
And
gosh.
so like,
Yeah.
how does that make sense?
Yeah.
It doesn't. It
Need to
you know
fix
it,
that
it
policy.
yeah, very much. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe it has. I mean, maybe McGill has changed. This is 20 years ago.
Yeah.
I hope it's changed, but at that time that it was 3 hours a day just to commute to
Hmm.
campus was crazy. Yeah,
I
yeah.
have another question before I get to Ben's question in the chat, which I'll get to in just a second. So, in the groups that you've led, in terms of like expeditions and seeing the wildlife and science, so were they all scientists, or were some of them like paying to go see,
Oh,
ecotourism? And then what's the difference in terms of managing both of those types of groups? I'm not going to say which one's easier because I don't know what the answer to that would be, but what's the difference?
yes, definitely. Excellent clarifying point. The polar bear trips, beluga whale trips, panda bears, Asiatic black bears,
Hmm.
and beluga whale trips, those were all for ecotourism.
Mm.
And the Everest one and the India and Bangladesh, that was pure scientists.
Okay.
So the wildlife trips that I guided, the non-scientists, very different audiences. So for polar bears, especially the polar bears, there's some people who save their whole lives just to see a polar bear, just the opportunity to see a polar bear in the wild, and
Mhm.
they've saved for years and years and years. And some of those people have spouses who are just kind of tagging along, and they're like,
Mhm.
"I'm just here because she made me do it." It's so very, very different
Yeah.
expectations. And very different personalities as a guide to handle.
Mhm.
And then there are some people who are like, oh, I've been around the world, I've been to Galapagos 5 times, I've been on safari in Kenya 10 times, like I'm just here because there's
Wow.
one more thing to do, one more notch. Yeah.
Hmm.
um and then there's other people on the Mongolia trip um who have always want to see snow leopard, would have rather done it themselves, but to get the permits and to do everything on their own and to find their way and to find the local contacts, is just next to impossible. So they
Mhm.
begrudgingly sign up with with a company as big as the one that I worked for, to go on a snow leopard trip. So their expectations are very different from, let's say, the other client who is incredibly affluent and is used to drinking a case of Diet Coke a day. And so it's my job to make sure we have Diet Coke every single day, a whole case, which
Yeah.
is impossible in remote areas guiding. But
Yeah.
as a guide, as a professional, to make sure that everyone has a trip of a lifetime, regardless of their background, regardless of their affluence, regardless of why they're there, that their needs are met, and that they are having a true trip of a lifetime. It's
Mhm.
definitely, wildlife guiding is more about people,
Mhm.
and I learned that quickly. It took me a good solid year of guiding different trips. That,
Mhm.
oh wow, it's not about the animals; it's about the people. It's about the clients. Yeah.
That's interesting to hear. I have another friend at Nat Geo who also does some of the Nat Geo expeditions. He said the same thing to me. It's it's different than taking scientists out or students out.
Mhm,
Yeah, different needs, and those needs have to be met. That's really fascinating.
mhm.
For the sake of time, let me make sure I get to Ben's question. He said, thinking of species that are either considered nuisances or charismatic, Are there any that are generally placed in one category that you feel would be better in the other?
Oh, oh, I really like that. I think it all depends on your perspective and where you live.
Mhm,
Nuisance animal to one is a charismatic to another. I love black bears. I think they're great. I don't perceive them as a nuisance. I definitely see how they can be if you're constantly, dealing with property damage, if your windows are broken, every time you wake up high, if but there's different ways, there's different management ways around that, and I think it's about changing your perspective and understanding the animal for what it is. A black bear is driven, is a slave to its nose. And
mhm,
so if you understand that to begin with, oh, okay, if I'm barbecuing outside today, I should know that I'm probably going to attract some animals around me, and I should take steps to make sure that I clean up right away. I don't feed my dog outside. I don't have a bird feeder, outside of the
mhm,
you know the seasons when birds need the seed. So it's about the intrinsic value, I think, of the animal, and less so about assigning it a category for how we would perceive it, if it's a
mhm.
nuisance or not. I'm not sure I would apply that to mice in my home. Yeah, I
Well,
think
there might be some
it's
people that
okay.
feel very strongly about the charisma of mice. I don't know. I'm not necessarily one of those people, but I hear you. I hear you. Now,
Yeah.
I think it's definitely to some extent, some of that might also be an environmental communication issue
Mhm.
where like a lot of people like don't like bugs, but if there's certain insects that you may be able to kind of talk to somebody about why is this important? This is how it's beautiful and kind of show them so that it can be, oh, okay, I never thought of it like that. And I know, like, I tend to think of wolves as being very charismatic species. Like a lot of people think, oh,
Mhm.
what a wonderful, what a beautiful animal. And then if you live in Idaho or Montana or Wyoming, you might feel very different if that's something that you have to deal with, especially if you have outdoor animals. Yeah, I think that's a good question, Ben, but also a good consideration of that, Sandra. And we're almost to the top of the hour, so I wanted to first thank you very much for our conversation. I also wanted to thank our audience for joining us today. And again, I put the link tree in there many times, but if you want to join any future events or see the recording of this in about 2 days, feel free to check out our social media and anything on our link tree. And then I also want to shout out to Taylor in the background, who's been letting people in to Teams. She's our magician in the background that helps these webinars run smoothly. So special thanks to Taylor. And also thank you, Dr. Sandra Elvin. So everyone have a wonderful rest of your day. Feel free to give us virtual applause in the chat. And hopefully we'll see you again at the next Goucher Environmental Dialogues.